has made. We will rejoice. And let me try it again. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. If you have your Bibles, Joshua chapter 4, be in prayer for the kingdom of God. One of God's great pulpiteers, someone who meant a lot to me as a mentor, as a preaching paradigm, went to be with the Lord on last night. Dr. Charles Edward Booth of Columbus, Ohio, passed away on last evening. Dr. Booth did my first revival here over 12 years ago. Proved himself to be a great mentor, shared in the last conversations we had. And so just a difficult time in the kingdom. Pray for his wife, his family, the Mount Olivet Church there in Columbus, Ohio. And he's just, once again, a great giant of a preacher, but also he's just a prince of a man. So pray for all those who will be standing today. It's a difficult day for the kingdom. But once again, as I always hear him say to me, he said, good men, preach what you believe and believe what you preach. So at the end of the day, I think that was always some good words that he gave us. Joshua chapter 4 today, reading from the New Living Translation. As we continue our thought and thinking through stranger things, I hope last week challenged us. And we're going to continue in that same vein and vibe as we look at today, Joshua chapter 4, selected verses out of this chapter. This is the word of God, beginning to verse 1. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight. Go down to verse 8 and 9. It says this. It says, so the men did as Joshua had commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, one for each tribe, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the place where they camped for the night and constructed the memorial there. Verse 9, Joshua also set up another pile of 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And they are there to this day. Look again at verse 9. Joshua also set up another pile of 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And they are there to this day. Time which is ours, I want to trouble your patience just for a little while. I want to preach from this start. Give God more stones. Touch your neighbor, say, neighbor, give him more, give him more. Lift those hands to heaven, say, Lord, speak. We need to hear. You may be seated in the presence of our God. Give God more stones. When I was matriculating through school, there was an incentive that our teachers would give us. Those of us who were overachievers in class, it was not just enough to try to get A's. We wanted to go above and beyond. We understood that every assignment, there was a minimal requirement. There was things that were supposed to be completed. Whoever invented this came up with a great idea. Those of us who are overachievers, they called this thing called extra credit. Extra credit was an interesting thing. It was when you would do extra work or add an extra thing to the assignments that you've already had. You could get extra credit, and extra credit could be added to your score. I know that the highest rate was 100, but if you did extra credit, it could be 105, 110. I am grateful to have teachers along my journey who understood that sometimes you need to allow students on their own initiative to give some extra credit. Now, it was not required. It was not what you had to do. You could pass the class. But for those of us who are overachievers, we look forward to doing extra credit. My brothers and sisters, I think that's interesting because I wonder how many of us in the classroom of the kingdom of God do extra credit. I mean, we do enough. I mean, yes, you show up to church. Yes, you tithe. Yes, you serve. But have you given God more than what is required? Let's be honest, my brothers and sisters, many times we begrudgingly kind of just do things and we oftentimes just do enough to satisfy what we feel will allow us to continue to sojourn and once again honor God. But I believe, my brothers and sisters, that there is a place, once we think about how good God has been to us, that we ought to give God not just the minimum, but we ought to give him some more. That's what our text begins to outline for us as we get to the book of Joshua, that book of transition. Matter of fact, when you read the book of Joshua, Joshua is important because it is the book that talks about them entering the promised land. They had been sojourning for 40 some years. A transition of leadership has taken place. And when you read the book of Joshua, this is their conquest. This is them entering the promised land God has for them. And when we get to Joshua chapter 4, it's an interesting chapter. Matter of fact, it's called the chapter of memorial. This is when, after God has allowed the waters to part in the Jordan River, when it was coming during what should have been an uncrossable period. The thing that happened in Joshua 4 is God did not want the children of Israel to forget what God had done. God didn't want them to continue into the promised land of Canaan and forget it was God that brought them through this Jordan River. So he commissioned to Joshua. He said, Joshua, this is what I need you to do. Get about 12 people, one to represent from each tribe of Israel. I want them to grab some stones from the riverbed. And when y'all get to the place of camping tonight, the place of Gilgal, I want you to build a memorial stone. There are going to be some people who's going to come by later on. They're going to see this stone and they're going to be reminded of the faithfulness of God in the midst of how he has kept you and delivered you through the Jordan River. That is what the text tells us. Joshua decides to do that. He commissions 12 men to get 12 stones for them to build this memorial to God. But verse 9 blessed me, my brothers and sisters, because when you read the text, this is what blessed me. Joshua, the text said, also on his own accord decided to build his own memorial. Even though God didn't ask him to do it, he still gave it to God anyhow. That even though God had only asked for one memorial to be built, one thing to be built, this is what I love about the text. Joshua without compulsion, Joshua without having God to tell him to do it, Joshua decided on his own to build his own memorial stone. And my brothers and sisters, I appreciate that today because it teaches us the reality at the end of the day, there ought to be some things God shouldn't have to prompt you. You ought to just want to do. There ought to be some stuff the pastor shouldn't have to nudge you. You ought to just want to do. There ought to be some stuff that in our lives, as we examine the goodness and the grace and the mercy of God, that we should not feel like it's an obligation, but we ought to be happy about it, because when we think of how good God has been to us, we ought to be willing to give God some more stone. That's what's powerful in our text. Matter of fact, building stones and monuments was not unusual. Matter of fact, this is what they would do to symbolize certain things. And I appreciate what Joshua shares in the text as he's trying to construct the vagabond people who have once again sojourned in the wilderness for 40 years. He's trying to develop a people of gratitude. And I love this because he teaches all of us who are leaders that we ought to lead by example. Here is Joshua in this moment, and he does what is not required. He does and goes above and beyond. And maybe that's the test for some of us today. As we look at our own lives, as you look at your own kingdom assignment, as you look at what you've been offering to God, I wonder, have you been giving God more? Have you been giving God more service? Have you been giving God more witness? Have you been giving God more worship? I wish I had some people, y'all real quiet at the 7:15. Have you been giving God more? I know you show up to church, and I know you do the bare minimum. I know you get by. You a good saved Christian. But at the end of the day, can God look at you and say, there's somebody I can trust with more? And I hear what some of you saying. Pastor, I feel you. Pastor, that sounds good, but you don't know, I'm already stretched to the max. But here's my thing. Why not give a God that does exceedingly abundantly more for us? Why not give him more of our own? That's, my brothers and sisters, real essence of the text. And I want to develop in us a theology of more. I think this text is really beginning us to understand that when we look back over our lives and view the work and the witness that God gives us, the proper response ought to be to give God more. Let me share some things quickly in this text. There are some things I think this text outlines for us today that shares with us perhaps the mindset of Joshua, because I believe that there is a blessing in the also. So what is it? What is it in our text, my brothers and sisters, that spurs Joshua and perhaps should spur us to give God more stone? First thing I think this text tailored to teach us is that perhaps Joshua and perhaps we should give God more because of previous preferences in God choosing us. When you look at this text, I submit to you that the reason perhaps that Joshua gave more is because when he looked back on life, he realized that God had chose him. That's important. Matter of fact, we can look at this from a corporate standpoint. I mean, at this point, my brothers and sisters, this is a pivotal time in the history of Israel. I mean, first of all, let's examine the corporate selection. I mean, have you ever thought about it? How far God had to bring the children of Israel? By the time we get to Joshua chapter 4, a lot has transpired. And I mean, they are a far cry from being those who are born from the loins and legacy of that great patriarch by the name of Abraham. They are a far cry from the patriarch of Isaac and Jacob, and even their foreparent by the name of Joseph. And now, my brothers and sisters, they had spent some time under captivity. If you read the book of Exodus, you'll know of the tragedy and the travail and the captivity that they had to struggle with for 450 years. They were under the oppressive rule of the Egyptian people. There, my brothers and sisters, all of a sudden God decided to raise up a liberator by the name of Moses. Moses' job, even though he was a stuttering prophet, was to deliver the people, liberate them from their oppression. Why? For one simple reason, so they could worship God. Y'all know the story. There was 10 rounds that goes forth, 10 plagues that took place. And all of a sudden, God decided to emancipate them from their horrific captivity. But my brothers and sisters, God understood that even though you can take the people out of Egypt, it's hard to take the Egypt out of people. And what should have been a surely just at max a few months sojourn, they end up spending 40 years in the wilderness. It was in the wilderness, my brothers and sisters, that they didn't have to fight, but God provided in the wilderness manna in the morning, quail at night. In the wilderness, God showed them that I can take your bitter water and turn it sweet. It was in the wilderness. God was a cloud by day and a fire by night. But what should have took only a few months ended up taking 40 years. And by the time we get to Joshua, can you do the math? 450 years of captivity, 40 years of wandering. And by the time they get there, they have now spent almost 500 years waiting to get in the promised land. But after all that happened, after 450 years, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, God, who had already given the promise to Abraham that the children of Israel will once again embrace the promise of the promise. And here they are, even though it took 500 years, they are now getting ready to enter the promised land. And my brothers and sisters, I believe that ought to be something for us to remember, is that when God says it, it may take some time, but when God says it, that settles it. God is going to bring that thing to pass. Maybe as Joshua was sitting there and he gave his own stones in the middle of the riverbed, maybe he was thinking corporately as a people how God has blessed us. And I believe there are a few people here under the sound of my voice that ought to be thankful that we got a God that corporately keeps his word, that when he declares what he's going to say, when he declares what he's going to do, he is faithful and just to bring that thing to pass. But maybe if it wasn't just a corporate selection that perhaps prompted him to declare that God chose us, maybe for Joshua, this extra memorial stone, watch this, perhaps for him was more personal than that. Because it wasn't just a corporate selection, but for Joshua, it was an individual selection. I mean, do you know the narrative of Joshua? Joshua is one of only two people at this point who has now remembered the entire journey through the wilderness. It was Joshua who was born in captivity in Egypt. And because of God's hand upon him life, he was once again called upon to be the right hand of Moses, the liberator. You know Joshua, my brothers and sisters. Matter of fact, he was part of that first group that was sent out to spy the land in Canaan. And only him and Caleb came back with a positive report. And God said everybody else but Joshua and Caleb are going to survive the wilderness. Everybody else, because of their disbelief, because they did not trust what I was trying to do, they will not see the promise. And so can you imagine for Joshua, who had to see his mentor, his father in life and in kingdom, Moses, passed on, him grabbed the mantle, and God said, I'm going to have the same favor on your life that I had on Moses. This same Joshua, who has now had to sojourn through 40 years, had to go through periods of pain. Now, as he looks and sees Canaan, the promised land, maybe for Joshua, he started to think back personally on his own life and see how far the Lord has brought him. And I don't know who I'm talking to today, because maybe you didn't shout over the corporate selection, but you ought to celebrate over the individual selection, because there's sometimes nobody else can tell you what God has done for you. I wish I had a few people in here. I know you sit there and you look good on this Sunday, and I know you come to church, and I know people just assume you sit in the same seat and you come and lift up your hands at the same time, but some of you got some amazing testimonies. And when you look back over your life, you can testify, if it had not been, I wish I had somebody like the Lord. I wish I had some. Don't fool me this morning. I want you to know today that when you look back over your life, you got some stories about how God chose you in spite of your circumstances, how God chose you in spite of the stuff you had to deal with, how God chose you coming from a bad relationship, a bad home, a bad job, and here you are still standing, here you are still smiling. Look at somebody and tell them, if I had more time, I could run the roll and tell you how far the Lord has brought me, because at the end of the day, the reason I do what I do now is because God didn't have to choose me, but he did. Reminds me of a man by the name of Alan Crabb. You may not know him. He's a professional basketball player, and he's known infamously in the NBA as having one of the worst NBA contracts of all time. He plays now for the Brooklyn Nets. Matter of fact, he's starting, but he did not always have that. Matter of fact, he just came at the right time. He was a guard for UC Berkeley, found himself in the league, languishing on the bench for the Portland Trailblazers, had a breakout year around 2016, and those of you who follow the NBA know that's when they had this inflation of salaries. And so they were just giving out money. Matter of fact, even though he only averaged about 10 points and about 4 rebounds, he signed a 4-year, $75 million contract. GMs, coaches, people around the league were astonished. He only averaged 10 points and about 4 rebounds, and now got a contract, 4 years, $75 million. People said this is the most ludicrous contract in the history of the NBA. They said his production does not manifest. How in the world can you invest that much money in someone like that? But I just read recently this week of an article that declared that even though some on the outside didn't think he deserved the money, what I read the article is he was donating a majority of a large paycheck to the school that raised him in Crenshaw, California. He went to a private school. Matter of fact, the private school is called the Fred Price Private School. Matter of fact, Fred Price, that great TV evangelist, is his grandfather. The article talks about how, even though people were once again talking about how much money he was making, he decided to take what God had blessed him with and invest in something that had helped rear him. He decided that even though others didn't think he deserved it, he talked about in the article how he was grateful that God decided to bless him, and since God had blessed him, he was going to bless somebody. Y'all ain't going to help me here. I know you got caught up in the money, but I appreciate this man, because for many of us, if you got that kind of money and you start to look back, most of you would have thought you pulled your own self up by your bootstraps. But he said, I believe this is an opportunity God gave me, and so since God chose me in this moment, the least I can do is help make an impact from the place where I can. Can I help you, my brothers and sisters, that I appreciate, just like Alan Crabb and just like I think God and Joshua wants us to understand, when you look back over life, the reason you ought to give more is because God has chosen you. It's not just previous preference and God choosing us is a reason to give God more stones, but also, I believe, secondly, the reason we ought to give God more stones is because of his proactive performance in catering to us. It's interesting, my brothers and sisters, note where and when Joshua builds the memorial stone. Text says there were literally, when you read it, there are some conjecture. I tend to land on the fact that there were 2 monuments built. Some have suggested only one, that these stones were then transitioned and transported, but the text does not read that way to me. I believe that there were 2 monuments built, the one by Joshua in the middle of the riverbed, and the one they'll build at their campsite called Gilgal. In other words, what was going to happen for the one at Gilgal, they were supposed to take the rocks from the riverbed, take it with them till they camped that night. But the text says that while the priests were still in the middle of the water, Joshua built his memorial stones right there. That's interesting, my brothers and sisters. You got to imagine what's happening in this moment. This was God's order to Joshua, and he told them, this is how you are going to cross the Jordan River. It was during flood season. So this is what I want you to do. There's no boats that you need. No. This is what I need you to do. Tell the priests to put the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders. And when they put their feet in the water, I'll push the water back. Matter of fact, this is what I want you to do. Tell them to keep going out till they're in the middle of the Jordan River. When they're in the middle of the Jordan River, then I'm going to push back all the water so that the children of Israel can cross over the Jordan safely and head into Canaan. Can you imagine that miracle? If I had time, I would tell you that what God taught them in Joshua 3 is that if you have a problem you can't cross, put God in it. But y'all look sleepy this morning, so I'm not going to push you. But Joshua 4 gives us some incredible insight. To read it correctly, you almost seem to suggest that the priests carrying the ark were still in the Jordan River. Now, here's what's interesting, my brothers and sisters. Its text seems to suggest to us that everyone had not yet made it over. The people had gotten over, but the priests with the Ark of the Covenant had not yet made it over. And it was at that period that Joshua decides to build his monument. What he does, my brother and sister, he builds his monument, watch this, during the miracle. God was still holding the water back. The Ark of the Covenant was still in the Jordan River. The people were waiting on the banks of the Jordan. And while God was still holding the water back, Joshua takes the time to build his memorial. See, the second stone was going to be built when they got to the place where they were camping. It would be a place called Gilgal. It would be when the waters have receded, when the Ark of the Covenant was now leading. But Joshua decided, watch this, not to wait till the miracle was over to build his memorial stone. But while God was still holding the water back, while the priests were still in the middle of the Jordan, he decides to go through the tenuous and the hard process of building his. Now you got to imagine, these are not small stones. These are rather large stones. This was going to take some time, but this is what I appreciate about Joshua. He teaches us that you shouldn't wait till after God is through to start honoring God. That while God is still doing the work, while God is still holding the water. I wish I had somebody here. My grandma could say it better. Don't wait till the battle's over. You ought to shout. I wish I had somebody. See, the problem with too many of us is you want to wait till everything has been manifested. You want to wait till the waters have rolled back. But Joshua teaches us that you don't wait till everything happens before you start honoring God. You don't wait till the miracle's over before you start honoring God, while God is still doing what God is doing. Somebody ought to testify. I'm going to take my good old time and praise him right now. I'm not going to wait till it's over. I'm not going to wait till I'm already healed. I'm not going to wait till the children come home. I'm not going to wait till the bills get paid. But while I'm still in the middle of the Jordan, I'm going to take some time and give God some prayer. I wish I had somebody with me that can look over life and can testify. I ain't going to wait till this thing gets over. I'm going to shout right now. That's why I have, be seated. That's why I have a lot of respect for LeBron James. No matter what you think about him from a basketball perspective, I respect LeBron James, watch this, because of the stuff he does off the court. We can argue all day long about his exploits on the court, but man, there is no one that I can think of that matches him off the court. And about a year or so ago, he did something that I would tell you just blew my mind. LeBron James decided to build his own school. That went over your head. See, I know that's stuff we don't talk about no more. We talk about records on the court, but man, this dude has decided to build his own school. I don't know about you, it made me look at my life and say, what else can I do? Brother man is building a school for underprivileged kids. Y'all missed it. Matter of fact, it's a special school. Well, he was going, because he remembered where he came from. If you know his story, you'll know that because of the unsettlement of his own home life, in his 4th grade year, he missed 83 days of school. He talked about how it was a hard thing, but he got in the right environment. And in 5th grade, after getting the right environment, is when he started playing basketball. So he talked about having the right environment as a thing that was going to help him be who he would ultimately become. Matter of fact, one of the great things about school is it not just to help the kids, it helps the parents as well. If the parents don't have an education, they just set up GED classes for them to get their education as well. You raise the issue, Pastor, why are you saying this now? Well, let me tell you why it impresses me is because LeBron is still playing. See, most people wait till after their career. They wait till after their days are done. They wait till after they have completed all that they could. But what impressed me most about what LeBron James did is he's still playing basketball. And while he's still playing basketball, he decides to invest in his community, which means he didn't wait till everything was over in order to make a difference. But while he was still in the middle of his career, he decided to do something. I wish I had some help. I'm here to tell you, my brothers and sisters, don't wait until everything gets manifested, that while God is still doing what God is doing, you ought to lift up holy hands. You ought to shout glory. Why? Because in the middle of it, you ought to still give God the glory. He gave this, watch this, Doc, during the miracle. But here's another thing, he displayed it at the miracle. Remember, the one that God ordered was just to be some stones set up off the shore at the place they camped. But Joshua's memorial was in the middle of the Jordan at the feet of the priests carrying the ark. He would now have his memorial in the middle of the Jordan. Now, let me tell you what caught my eye. My homiletical imagination is that as long as the waters were back, you could see these stones. As long as the miracle was going on, you could tell there was stones in the middle of the Jordan. But the Jordan River was not always going to be like that. There was going to come a point when the priest would take the ark out of the middle of the Jordan, God would release his power, and the water would come crashing down. Which means on a normal day, you wouldn't be able to see these stones for yourself. In other words, the one that God was building at Gilgal was going to be visible. But the one Joshua was building in the middle of the Jordan was going to be personal. That people, if they did not know, could not see for themselves what Joshua built. It would be covered by the Jordan River. But just because it wasn't going to be visible didn't stop Joshua from building it anyhow. Just because other people were not going to be able to see it did not stop him from building it in it. Just because other people would not come by and talk about, look at the 12 stones in the Jordan, did not stop Joshua from building it. I know this is going to mess some of y'all up, because sometimes we only do stuff when other people can see it. Sometimes we only build stuff when other people can pat us on the back. But what I appreciate about Joshua is Joshua had that much appreciation for God that he understood, if don't nobody else see it, if don't nobody else know what I've done, if nobody else sees the 12 stones I gave to God, here's the good news: I know what I did, and just because it ain't public don't mean it ain't powerful. I wish I had some help, because that's the problem we have today in the social media context, is everybody wants to show off everything that you're doing. But can I tell you something? I've learned this throughout the days that God has shown me, is that sometimes some stuff ain't for everybody. Sometimes what you do ought to just be between you and between God, that everything you do ain't for everybody's consumption, but some stuff you ought to do because God's been just that good to you. Look at somebody and tell them, you ain't got to let everybody know, just do it anyhow. People may not pat you on the back, but do it anyhow. They may not see your service, but do it anyhow. Is there anybody here that can say, I'm going to do it anyhow? That's the problem. That's the challenge. And I appreciate Joshua in the text because he lets us know that when you got a true heart for the things of God, you ain't worried if everybody sees it or not. Because you know who you're doing it for. For the financial fast, I will admit to you, part of my challenge is because of my schedule, Dr. Brown, I don't get to go out shopping for myself. So a lot of times I have to shop online. And here's the challenge with shopping online is you don't really know what you're getting. I mean, you're really taking a gamble. You know, you got to really and so it's imperative when I'm shopping online, one of the main things I do is I look at the ratings. I got to read the reviews. I have to filter through what other people thought about a certain product. And if we'll be honest, that's how we live life. We live life based on ratings. We rate products online. We rate cars that we want to buy. We look at that. Matter of fact, that's what some of us do with our own lives. And we value ourselves based on how we've been rated, how people think we are, and what people think we do. But can I tell you, that's antithetical to the kingdom. You shouldn't do stuff based on how you've been rated, but you ought to do stuff based on what you love and know about God. I wish I had some help. That's why I appreciate my grandfather. Even to this day, I appreciate his selfless act. I appreciate the work that he did. I appreciate because granddad was not one to ever let his name be known, even though he did so much other stuff. And I wonder how many of us do the same thing in life. And your whole thing is, if nobody else knows, as long as God knows, I'm fine. Tells us in the text, we give God more stones based on the previous preference in God choosing us. We give God more stones based on the proactive performance in God catering to us. But then thirdly, this is what he tells us. I give God more stones based on how of the perpetual promise for God compensating us. Verse 9 says something intriguing. Text says, if you read the end of verse 9, it says simply this, and they were there to this day. That's an interesting thing, my brothers and sisters. Here is what's intriguing, because I submit to you that when one begins to study this area, there were some things that many scholars have suggested that the memorial at Gilgal didn't last. For some reason, throughout the years, they had finally taken its place. There was some desecration that took place. The rocks that were built by the people didn't last. But it's interesting that the one Joshua built in the middle of the Jordan is still there to this day. The one that they put on the shore for everybody to see didn't last. But the one in the middle of the Jordan that was covered by the Jordan River, the text says is still there. Y'all miss what I'm saying. In other words, my brothers and sisters, can you imagine? For those, this was important. Why? Because the construction of stones was crucial. This was God's intent for them, that I want you to build these stones because I need you to have a physical reminder. I need you to have something to remind you of what I've done for you on this day. But here's what's interesting is the building of stones was not just for that day. It was also meant to be a remembrance going forward. Can you imagine for Joshua and them as they saw the priests began to walk out of the Jordan River and they began to come on shore? Can you see as the waters began to rush back and the stones that he built in the middle of the Jordan were now covered by the Jordan River? And can you imagine now this was important because by the closing of the Jordan, it was also a closing of a chapter. After 40 some years of wandering in the wilderness, they have now accomplished the task. They're getting ready to move into Canaan. But here is what I appreciate about the miracle of the Jordan is that God didn't keep the waters apart. because it was never intended for the children of Israel to go back. So God had to close it in order to force them to go forward. But notice what the stones now represent is that what God said in the stones is, if you saw me do it before, you can rest assured I can do it. Okay, I don't know who I'm talking to, but what I appreciate about this is that this stone was not just symbolic of what God can do, it's also symbolic of what God is about to do. In other words, the stones, my brothers and sisters, that Joshua built was a reminder to him that the way I got you through the Jordan, the way I got you through the wilderness, the way I brought you out of Egypt, even though you're going into a new land that you don't know, you're going to have to fight enemies you never fought before. Here's the good news is that if I did it before, I can do that thing again. I wish I had time, because I would tell you God is good at giving us reminders of what he's done so that we can know what he's about to do. I've got to close. May the Lord bless you real good. But if you were ever to go to Clemson University and go to their football stadium, they call it the Death Valley. You'll notice that whenever the football team runs out on the field, they would rub a rock. It's interesting, my brothers and sisters, when they rub this rock, most people don't know what this rock stands for. The name of this rock is called the Howard Rock. It was given to them in the 1960s. Matter of fact, it was their coach by the name of Frank Howard that was given by one of their boosters this rock from a place called Death Valley in California. But here's what's interesting. When it was first given to Coach Howard, he used it as a doorstop. He had it in his office, really didn't want anything to do with it, and he asked one of the people there, man, just get rid of this. It's cluttering up my office. They decided to put it on a pedestal in the Coliseum where they play football. And so that next year began the tradition of them rubbing the rock as they get ready to go out on the field. Now it has grown throughout the years, the mythology of it. Why? Because there was one particular game when the Clemson football Tigers were losing badly, and he said to them, listen, don't y'all touch the rock if you're not going to give 110%. And so the text saying that if you go back in history, you'll learn they came back and won the game. And so now before every game, every Clemson football player is going to rub the rock, because the rock is a reminder that how they won before, and how they won before they can win again. Y'all missing what I'm saying today, and I'm here to tell you that that's what I appreciate about God, because we don't need Howard's rock and you don't need Joshua's rock, but there is also another rock that God gave us because he wanted us to know that if I did it before, I can do it again. Y'all looking at me funny, but you do realize in Psalm 118 that there was a stone that the builders rejected, and even though it was rejected, it still became the cornerstone, the rock I'm talking about. If you ever want to know what God is going to do, if you ever want to know how far God is willing to go in order to deliver you, there's a rock by the name of Jesus. Do I got anybody here that can look over your life and tell them, I've been leaning on that rock the whole time, because that rock is everything to me, which means that since that rock has done everything to me, the least I can do is give everything to the rock. Maybe that's why they sang that song, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Do I got anybody here that said, I'm going to give God more? Why? Because the more he's done for me, the more I can give to him. Everyone standing, I'm done. Give God more stones. Stop just doing enough. Why does God have to tell us everything? There's a blessing in the also. And this thing prompted me because I think for many of us, we just happy being average believers. I hate to inform you, but just doing enough don't really make you that special. Like people hit me up all the time, Pastor, I tithe. That's what you're supposed to do. You want a cookie? Like, Pastor, I go to church. That's what you're supposed to do. Like, sometimes I get amazed at people that want superstar status for just doing average things. We do the bare minimum. You barely at the 10. You barely come, but you come. And when you show up, you want everybody to part the ways. So-and-so's here. But that ain't more. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to give. You're supposed to come to church. The true blessing is in the more. Don't tell me you just do this but you can do more. And just because God doesn't explicitly put it out there, I don't know about you, but any teachers and educators understand. You can pass with a C. You can get all the way through school with a C average. Matter of fact, you get all the way through school with a D average. Just doing enough. But at what point are you going to make up your mind, I want to do more? I want to do more. I don't know who I'm challenging today. But yes, you do enough. And yes, you saved. Yes, you have checked off every requirement. But there's more you can do. There's more you can offer. There is more you can provide. And that more don't have to be on public view. It don't have to be for everybody to see. You don't need somebody to have to tell you, no, pastor said. No, just do more. Because when I think of the goodness of Jesus, all he's done for me. I don't know what was in Joshua's mind, but that had to be an amazing moment to have what God told him, and he added something extra to it. When was the last time you did more? When was the last time you gave more? When was the last time you served more? When was the last time you just gave God more stuff?